Morning, everybody. We'll go ahead and kick off the FAM-P meeting for Monday, May 6th. And on the 4th was May the 4th be with you. Those are in Star Wars. I may have watched Star Wars. Yeah.
All participants, please mute. I hope we're not being hacked.
That sounded like somebody doing a double Zoom.
Yeah, it's a lot of double Zoom.
Hold on, folks.
Not good extra credit for watching another Zoom.
Okay, folks, sorry for that hiccup. My name is Gloria Edwards, and I'm the director of the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network. So welcome to our webinar, Understanding the Challenges of Defining and Assessing Fuels Treatment Effectiveness. This is very interesting research, hot off the press, that has compared a lot of categorizations and classifications across fuels treatments and had significant implications. The Southern Rockies Fire Science Network is part of the National Joint Fire Science Program. We're one of 15 fire science exchange chapters, and the Southern Rockies region covers from southern Wyoming to eastern central Utah to the Arizona, New Mexico, southwestern borders, and right here to the Front Range. So with that, I will just share a couple of housekeeping notes. The webinar is being recorded, and we'll do some minor edits to the recording, and it will be posted to the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network YouTube channel. Please post your questions and comments and resources you would like to share in chat. I will be monitoring and facilitating the questions that come through chat. And chat and resources will be shared to attendees and the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network after the webinar. If there's no other questions or issues, we'll go ahead. I'd like to introduce Tony Vorster, Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory at Colorado State University.
Thanks, Gloria. All right, good morning, everybody. We're excited to be here today to talk about some of these ideas around fuel treatment effectiveness that we've been working on with a big group the last couple of years. Let's start off with introductions. And so we have all the panelists shown here on the screen. Oh, yeah, our screen is showing up. And so there's 4 of us here in person: Daniel, myself, Camille, and Matt. And then Greg Aplet is online, joining us from Denver. Matt, you want to start off with introducing yourself?
Yeah, good morning. My name is Matt Thompson. I am with Pyrologics and Vibrant Planet. Good to be here.
Good morning, I'm Daniel Bowker. I'm a forester with the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed, nonprofit here in Fort Collins.
I'm Camille Stevens-Rumann. I'm an associate professor in the Forest and Rangeland Stewardship Department and a part of the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute.
And Greg?
Yeah, Greg Aplet here, coming at you from Arvada, Colorado. I'm a forest ecologist with the Wilderness Society.
And I'm Tony Vorster, a research scientist here at CSU's Natural Resource Ecology Lab. So the way this is set up is we each have prepared roughly 10 minutes of kind of like flash talk style presentations, and so that'll take roughly 50 minutes, and then after that open it up for discussion and question and answer time with there's folks both here in the room and online, so we'll manage the dual audiences here. All right, so today, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about different interpretations of treatment effectiveness. And when we talk about this, we're looking at forest management designed to mitigate severe wildfire outcomes. And you're going to hear about a lot of different elements of treatment effectiveness and how we, through our own work, see kind of interpret treatment effectiveness. And as we've been working with this big group over the years, I think it's flavored how we think about each of our own respective work. And so we'll talk a little bit about that, like how these concepts kind of percolated down through research, like the university partners here, implementation, like that Daniel will talk about with his work at the Coalition for the Blue River Watershed, and ultimately why this all matters. Yeah. Okay, so this story for me starts a few years back. Wandering around with, so Camille had come out to visit a study site of ours, and we were walking around for a little while, and she asked me a really simple question that somebody researching treatment effectiveness should be able to answer. She said, so is this treatment effective? And I pulled my words and had a really hard time answering that. And, you know, so we were, so that was telling to me that I couldn't answer a very simple question. It was, you know, is where we're standing, where you've been taking all these measurements for years about the burn severity, about the tree survivorship, was that an effective treatment? And I think that now that we've talked through these ideas a lot more, one of the big reasons I was held up in answering these questions is because I didn't have the clear distinction in my head between those of you in the room, that's effectiveness. A clear distinction of effects and effectiveness. And so when we're looking at these forest management activities and their impacts on wildfire, there's the effects, which are the measurable things, right? What was the change in tree survivorship and comparable treated and untreated is. And that's, those measurable things are different than the effectiveness, which is values-based judgment on if the effects, those effects that you're observing, were they enough to accomplish those goals that were laid out? And Tony Chang is here sitting in the room, and maybe he's really good at speaking to these differences, and maybe during Q&A, if you time in there, Tony. And once we get this terminology straight, it was helpful for me to think, okay, we can think about all the different effects of fires. And then we can kind of parse that out from the effectiveness of these treatments, which gets into engagement with the community and the forest managers there, and really seeing if it was, those effects were ultimately met the goals. So this work, a lot of the concepts we're talking on today are in this paper here that we published earlier this year, and we're going to have this link. We'll share a link to this that's open access, and anybody can take a deeper dive in. But in this paper, we lay out different metrics of treatment effects. Notice I'm going to be purposeful here about effects versus effectiveness. These, and we group them into three categories. There's the human fire metrics, things like how many did the treatments reduce the number of the amount of structural damage, or did it impact the success of the fire suppression activities during the fire? Those are the human fire metrics. The second category that we broke it down into is fire behavior metrics. So did the treatments, did they impact flame lengths, or was it the impact of fire type, like a active crown fire versus surface fire, things like that. And then lastly, the ecological metrics. You know, how did it change the outcomes of the fire on watershed health, or on tree survival? And you're going to hear about these different metrics from some of our different speakers today. Greg's going to talk about how these metrics can be helpful in thinking about landscape management, different areas of the landscape. You might be prioritizing different types of these treatment effects. Matt has a lot of experience with some of those human fire metrics, especially like suppression activities. And Camille is going to dive deeper into the ecological metrics. And Daniel's going to talk about how everybody sees these, all the different stakeholders, you know, maybe are putting more weight on some of the types of metrics than others. So if I could go back now, and I'm hoping that happens again. Camille asked me that question. Was this treatment effective when we're standing out in the field? I think I'd have a better answer now. And I would, you know, I would talk about the effects of tree survivorship and the soil conditions, and be able to, you know, say the treatment resulted in, you know, this many more live trees in the on average in the treated and untreated areas. And then I would refer back to the management plan and the treatment goals, and really talk about think about, you know, what conditions that treatment burned in, and then I might be able to say if the treatment was truly effective, and I might break it out and say, yeah, it was effective in tree survival, but it was not effective in some of these other metrics, like stopping the fire, and really being specific with those metrics that I was speaking to. So see that I'm already going over my 10 minutes here. So I think I'll wrap up with why this matters. I think that having this precise terminology can help communications between all the different stakeholders that are working in this space. You know, we could be talking about a planned prescribed burn, and you know, the forester might be thinking about how that's going to hopefully confer resilience to that stand when a fire comes through. The community member with the house right there might be thinking, oh, this is going to stop the fire. That's the metric that's the outcome I'm thinking of for this prescribed fire. And you know, the fire crew might be thinking, oh, I'm going to be putting my fire lane through here. And without being clear about what we hope for these treatments to achieve in terms of mitigating these severe fire effects, we can talk past each other really easily, and not just in the planning process, but afterwards when we're saying, was this effective? And one of those people might say yes, you know, if there was tree survivors, but the other person might say no, it wasn't effective. It wasn't effective, and I think just as we get more specific with our language, we can get deeper into these conversations, and that we can hopefully look across these metrics to really have a holistic view of how these forest treatments are impacting fire and what we hope to achieve with them. So with that, I'm gonna pass it over to Matt, right? Did we say?
I think Greg's gonna advance the meeting.
Oh, Greg, yeah, Greg, yep. So Greg Aplet now is going to share some thoughts. Maybe I should, didn't have any slides.
Yeah, I don't have any slides. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. Yeah, sorry, I messed things up by not having any slides. Yeah, I'm, as I said, Greg Aplet. I'm a forest ecologist with the Wilderness Society. For those of you who don't know the Wilderness Society, we're a national nonprofit conservation organization founded in 1935 by a number of luminaries in the forestry sector, Bob Marshall, Aldo Leopold, Benton Mackay, the father of the Appalachian Trail. You may have heard of some of these guys, and several others. Two, as Bob Marshall said in his 1930 paper on the problem of the wilderness, we were founded to fight for the freedom of the wilderness. And as part of that fight, we have sought to sustain the ecological processes that have maintained wilderness ecosystems over time. And for the last couple of decades plus, we have worked at it within the organization to try to restore fire to fire-dependent ecosystems wherever it's safe to do that. And in doing that, we have recognized that the objective of restoring fire is not going to make much progress until people feel safe in their homes and are able to are comfortable with fire. And so we've kind of taken a whole landscape approach to the problem and thought about the landscape in terms of 3 zones. You can think of in any given landscape, there's likely to be some built environments and communities where we simply don't want fire, or at least we don't want fire in the built fuels. We don't want to see the loss of homes or property damage. But far away from communities, you might find yourself a place that's far enough away that we don't really need to worry about those communities, and we can allow natural fire to burn on its own terms. And so so-called wildland fire use fires back in the day when such term existed. And then in between, there's sort of this tension zone where we're not comfortable with fire, but fire doesn't have an immediate threatening effect on those communities. And there we're probably going to continue to suppress, but it gives us some flexibility in how we treat fuels to achieve different objectives. We've talked about that what a lot of people have referred to as the wildland urban interface. We have called it in the past the community fire planning zone, not because we don't think that wildland urban interface is a useful term, but we really like to focus on the aspect of advanced planning in anticipation of fire and preparing for fire well in advance. And we think that's super important in the community fire planning zone. There, you're going to be making treatments to reduce the probability of fire burning houses. That distant zone that I mentioned, we call the fire use emphasis zone. It's a zone where really any fire management alternative is possible depending on the conditions, but we really want to stress the use of wildland fire to achieve ecological benefit. And then in between that tension zone, we've called the wildfire resilience zone, because while we're still going to suppress in that zone, we want to create the conditions that will allow fire, when it does escape, not to cause undesirable ecological outcomes. And that's the place where we really want to focus our restoration efforts, to create a forest structure that when fire does escape, it causes minimal ecological damage. So we've been thinking about this way for some time, but in getting involved in this paper, it was really a kind of an epiphany for me that while these pieces fit together, each one really has a different objective, and therefore you have to evaluate effectiveness differently depending on the objective. And so, for instance, in the community fire planning zone, effectiveness might be evaluated based on whether treatments reduced damage to property or kept or created sufficient conditions for egress. In the fire use emphasis zone, the objective is you're not really trying to have an influence on fire per se. You just want to make sure that your treatments are able to catch fire at the line where you don't want fire to spread beyond. And then in between, the first reaction to fire is going to be to suppress. And so treatments, you probably want those treatments to aid in the suppression mission. But you also want those treatments to result in positive ecological outcomes in the event that the fire does escape. And so you want some ecological restoration as a result of those fires. And each of those different objectives has to be evaluated differently. One of the issues that the paper covered was the issue of scale, and I think that's important here. in each of those zones, the scale of evaluation is going to be different as well. In the community fire planning zone, obviously, you're looking to see whether treatment had a direct effect on community safety. And so it's a matter of whether individual treatments had a local consequence. Similarly, in the fire use emphasis zone, as I said, since the treatments aren't really intended to affect fire per se, the treatments themselves are very local in their effect. We're trying to stop fire's advance when we at the point where we don't want fire to pass beyond. And in between, you've got this wildfire resilience zone where you really want your treatments to have an effect over the entire scale of the zone. You really want to create conditions where suppression can be more effective, and wherever it starts within the zone, and you want to create conditions that will be resilient to fire wherever fire burns within that zone. I think that's kind of the opposite of the way we've thought about scale in fire management, where we've thought about the wildland urban interface as this kind of vast zone where we just want to protect communities, but we've thought about it as a kind of zonal thing. And similarly, wildland fire use has been something that we've applied to large areas of wilderness and haven't really thought about it as a local scale treatment problem. And in between, we've kind of been doing these random acts of restoration, doing fuel treatments in spot locations without really thinking about their effects at a larger scale. So that's another aha moment for me in working on this paper, is the way it's helped me think about the effect, or the effect of scale on effectiveness. The other piece that I wanted to mention specifically was that the paper touches on is the importance of affecting perceptions. I mentioned at the outset that we recognize that we're not going to make much progress in expanding fire use if people don't feel safer in their homes. And so that it's as important that we change perceptions of people in their homes, in their communities, as it is that we actually change the conditions on the ground. Because even if we achieve desirable conditions on the ground and people still feel unsafe, we're still never going to get to where we need to get to. Last, I'll just close by saying that all of this has made me think about the way in which objectives change from place to place across the landscape. And I have become a real devotee of localized fire planning for landscape effect. Matt's going to talk in his presentation about potential operational delineations. I've become a big fan of pods because of the way that they allow us to carve up the landscape and think about objectives on a local level, engage stakeholders in what we really want to accomplish in particular places, and then design treatments to accomplish those objectives. So at this point, I'll yield to Matt, who can kind of take it from here.
Okay, thanks, Greg. Yeah, so again, I'm Matt Thompson. I'm an affiliate faculty here at CSU. I was with the Human Dimensions program in the Rocky Mountain Research Station for a little over 14 years, working with a group called the Wildfire Risk Management Science Team. And that team really kind of had a focus on wildfire management. And we looked at kind of operationally focused fire management planning, and that is what Greg alluded to with the PODS framework. We also sought to deliver useful kind of analytics for incident management. And so a lot of the tools we built, like potential control locations and suppression difficulty index and PODS and quantitative wildfire risk assessments, we're kind of in service of providing actionable information when you're responding to incidents. And so when it comes to fuels effectiveness, we often look at it through that lens of how and to what extent did it change suppression decisions, suppression actions, suppression tactics, or the effectiveness thereof. In my current role as the Director of Applied Science at Pyrologics, there's a lot of overlap and common through lines. And so throughout my entire 14 years at the Rocky Mountain Research Station, Pyrologics was there doing quantitative wildfire risk assessments, was there with pods. And we also did a lot of work collectively on kind of simulation-based approaches to look at field treatment effectiveness. And so those kind of two angles kind of framed my thinking about this. So I came up with hopefully a fairly interpretable kind of 2x2 matrix. Thinking about treatment effects, they have effects on fire impacts. And referring to the slide that Tony showed earlier, there's things like ecological metrics, and there's also just changes to fire behavior. And then those in turn have an indirect effect on fire response in terms of where we choose to deploy people and how effective they are. And then the other kind of two dimensions are just thinking in terms of the modeling world and the analysis world, whether we're building predictive models that say what might happen, or we're building descriptive models that say what did happen. And in the lower left there, descriptive models, I would argue that maybe that's where we're most mature. We have remote sensed imagery, we have burn severity, we have field monitoring. I think the kind of upper right quadrant is where there's some work to do, and I'll kind of speak through that. So I'll kind of quickly work my way through this with some insights and how it ultimately relates to kind of treatment effectiveness metrics. First, we often see for predictive models of treatment effects, like I alluded to earlier, there's a lot of reliance on simulation-based approaches to fire modeling paired with some form of exposure or risk analysis. So this is an example of kind of optimized spatial fuel treatment strategies in New Mexico. And these sorts of things are kind of common throughout the literature. The work of Alan Ager, for example, has been really influential here. Moving one quadrant over, and this is a lot of the work that our team built, specifically Kit O'Connor, Chris Dunn, and others really helped us come up with analytics that can inform where on the landscape are we more likely to see fires stop or be contained, and that can inform decisions of where to deploy resources. We also have tools like suppression difficulty index that say where it might be hazardous to put people due to either limited accessibility, steep slopes, potential exposure to heat. And what I think has been really interesting, and this gets back to some of the points that Greg made, is that we're really seeing this improved integration here. And this has really been over the past 7 or so years. We sort of brought up the idea of pods, which frankly is a very old idea with the new labeling on it. And then that's really been kind of amplified and enhanced by working with collaborators here at CFRI, as well as Oregon State University and elsewhere. And we kind of really blend, like characterizations of where in the landscape are we likely to see beneficial fire effects, negative fire effects, where we can do something about it from a management perspective, either through identifying locations on the landscape where we can kind of safely and effectively engage fire, or where treatment might be necessary. And so the figure on the right was made by Angela Hollingsworth here at CFRI. And it basically kind of articulates where if you identify in a cross-boundary collaborative fashion, where these pod boundaries are, you can begin to treat them. It provides opportunities, for example, to create anchors for intentional prescribed burning. It also provides some opportunity to contain fires, potentially serve as anchors under moderate conditions. And I think the ARP here, the Arapahoe Roosevelt Forest, is really kind of pioneering and leading the way in terms of this integration of these tools, predictive models of fire impacts, of fuel treatment effectiveness, of response effectiveness, and designing these landscape scale strategies. And so Daniel Godwin has some really fantastic talks that sort of just walk through the insight and the analytics behind these tools. One of the ideas here on the ARP is to build this kind of north-south ribbon by treating in the Ponderosa Pine Zone and, basically connecting a series of pods so that, just as Greg said, these might be considered sort of that wildfire resilient zone, where you want to be able to get the ecological outcomes you want, while also facilitating suppression so that those fires don't move further east and into the Front Range communities. But what do we know about this lower right-hand quadrant? What do we know about fuels and response? And the answer is very little. There's a great paper that came out of here at CSU, Courtney Schultz's Public Law Policy Group, maybe it's Public Lands Policy Group, that basically interviewed a bunch of incident management personnel for how and to what extent they use fuel treatments in incident management. They do, of course, and there's a lot of benefits that they provide, but they also reported that sometimes the communication of the location and the type and the age of treatments was incomplete. Oftentimes they found that the treatments were not at sufficient scale to actually meaningfully affect both fire outcomes or their opportunity to safely engage. And they often weren't located in like strategic containment locations. So that also refers back to one of Greg points about this idea of random acts of restoration as opposed to like strategically connected and located treatments. And then on the right, just to go even deeper, we frankly, apart from just continuing to say we are successful at initial attack 98% of the time, have no real useful metrics of large fire suppression effectiveness. And this great review by Matt Plusinski a number of years ago just kind of inventoried and cataloged all of these gaps in our understanding of large fire suppression effectiveness. And that was really the motivating factor behind kind of the wildfire risk management science team's large body of research in the past several years, is really trying to inform this feedback loop, because at present it's really attenuated. It's largely driven by what's up here in fire managers' brains. It's not always institutionalized. It's not always well documented. So the evidence, the base of evidence is very limited. And so just in my last few minutes here, what I wanted to highlight is some promising opportunities that actually Alex Arkowitz here at Colorado State University is leading. It's a infrastructure project funded by the Washington Office of the Forest Service. It's called Wildfire Treatment Outcomes. And specifically what Alex is leading is a fire line effectiveness study. So that's what FLD stands for. Basically, for the first time, and it's going to be published as a research data archive pretty soon, we're going to have quality control, not only fire perimeters, but locations of all the fire line that incident personnel put on the landscape. And then that spatial overlay allows us to identify how much line actually successfully contained the fire, how much line never engaged the fire, perhaps it was part of an indirect strategy or a contingency line, and how much line burned over. And some of the emerging findings that we're seeing, there's been a handful of kind of preliminary studies also done by, for example, Ben Gannon, who got his PhD here at CSU. For every 3 miles of line that's built, only about 1 mile holds. So the rates of effectiveness of fire line when you get into the large fire environment are a very different number than the 98% we commonly hear of for initial attack. So we think there's kind of some real important information to be gleaned here in terms of under what conditions are different types of line and different locations of line more or less effective, and how can we learn from it. And so on that point, Alex is kind of pioneering, and this is my baby. This is the project I had before I left, so I'm still very connected to it. An overlay of historical treatment locations and seeing whether there's a signal in terms of how effective built fire line is inside of and outside of treated areas. And I know this slide is far more complicated that I can get into, but we were able to leverage a lot of really excellent data on the Dixie fire, which has a whole inventory of previous mechanical and prescribed as well as historical fires by fire severity, and we're able to kind of really tease out different rates of line holding on the basis of how old prior treatments was, how severe the previous treatments were. In hindsight, I probably should have chosen a simpler diagram. But the point being, the sort of signals you see are in a good way, like very intuitive, which is to say that areas that previously burned at high severity also tended to burn at high severity. We tended to have lower effectiveness of line in areas that burned at high severity. But by contrast, where there were previous prescribed burns or areas that previously burned at low severity, effectiveness was higher. I think there's a number of challenges with using the Dixie fire in particular. It's sort of an extreme event in many regards. Obviously, its magnitude and its ecological impact. It was also probably the single largest workload event in recorded history. At one point, it had 3 out of every 4 assigned firefighters. They built enough line to go from Seattle to Pittsburgh and back. I think they had 300,000 person hours working on that fire. So the point here is that we're not going to necessarily learn a huge amount of insight on treatment effectiveness and suppression effectiveness on this very unique event. But what Alex has been able to do is kind of pioneer these methods that we're now going to apply to dozens, if not hundreds of fires. And so I think we're at a turning point where we will be begin to be able to speak more comprehensively, concretely, and objectively about how treatments affect suppression effectiveness. And so stay tuned. Thank you.
All right. Well, so we
Sorry,
talked about,
do it.
yeah, I'm
Get
gonna,
rid of that bar, just so you can see the slides, maybe we can move. it.
Yep.
Maybe the cameras too. We don't need those on.
Oh.
Yes.
Really.
Yeah, but then also just the laptop screen if you still
Oh my gosh, okay.
No,
All right, we had something. What happened?
no, it's okay, it's okay.
Oh,
As long as you have access to your slides.
yeah, it's fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's supposed to be blank right now. Don't worry, Gloria.
I'm not, I'm just,
All right.
we get it back. It's okay.
Okay, let's see if I can get it back.
Yeah.
Oh, we're on to Daniel's. Not yet. Okay. So we've heard about, kind of the human element to it, right? That we all integrate with, and can, even if you haven't been on any of these fires that we've talked about so far, you have a human connection with, right? You can think about places that you've seen high severity fire impacts that you wish maybe there had been a treatment that you would consider effective. You can think about what that land, those beautiful wilderness areas that you want to see managed naturally versus that place near your cabin that you hope that treatment is actually effective at potentially stopping. And what I want to talk about just very briefly is kind of thinking about the ecology of these landscapes and how difficult, even though, as Matt pointed out, we have lots of data on those ecological metrics of effectiveness and effects, how difficult it can actually be. And I liked these two pictures just to highlight this because we have a lot of places where if I'm looking at the remotely sensed data from these two places, it's going to show that the orange tree had lower burn severity, right? You can see that all the needles are still on that tree. It is, there was very different fire behavior, obviously, that moved through these two landscapes. Fire did not burn through the top of this orange tree. But as a person who really loves trees, in both cases, we have 100% mortality, right? And so we often have to examine when we ask these big landscape scale questions, when we talk about the Dixie Fire or the Cameron Peak Fire that are really large, that have really varied effects. We use often remote sense data to help us make decisions, to help us decide what areas are areas of concern that we need to do some post-fire management action in it. But we could have a situation like this where we have still 100% tree mortality, but the data that we're picking up remotely is saying something that actually this was a moderate severity burn in the case of this orange tree. And, as a person who loves trees, that's concerning to me, right? I want to know exactly where all the trees have died versus where there's those little nuggets or even large landscapes that actually burned at low to moderate severity. And we have a lot of potential future seed sources and surviving trees. But I think it's also on that ecological side important to think about, while I focus primarily on trees, there's a lot of things that it does really matter whether you have the picture on the right or the picture on the left happening, right? Things like watershed processes, right? You might have less soil burn severity in that picture on the right. You might have less impact on those soil communities as well as that seed bank, so for the potential for that larger plant community to come back might look really differently in those two places. As well as potentially carbon, right? Carbon storage is something that we have a lot of concerns and issues about. That's growing as we have more climate change impacts. And so you might see that even though, again, both trees are dying, there's a different level of long-term storage of carbon in these different landscapes. And so I think it makes this all a really complicated, convoluted conversation to have, I think, when we talk about effects and effectiveness, because I can tell you that both places are 100% tree mortality, but that probably doesn't tell you what many people are worried about when they think about effectiveness, right? That tree on the right, again, that's all orange, it may have died, but if there was $1 million house on the other side of it that they effectively were able to stop a fire from going into or burning through, then who cares about that one more orange tree that's becoming dead, right? So I think there's just a lot of things that we were talking about today and exploring in this paper that really get at how complex these different metrics and interactions of these metrics play into our narrative. And I think with that, I'll think about how that narrative turns into action on the ground. Unless, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that was great. I guess I would have one thing, looking at these pictures, like, is a good example too of our interpretation of effectiveness is different on what ecosystem you're in too, right? If you're in a multiple pine forest, it might be expected that you have complete tree mortality, and your determination of effectiveness is very different there than it is in ponderosa pine, where complete overstory mortality is going to be a lot longer time than to recover that forest. And so you have maybe the same outcomes, two different forest types and different determinations of effectiveness just based on that. These pictures maybe look at this one.
Right, there's a little dance going on here. Yeah. Oh. Cool, thank you guys. Again, I'm Daniel Bowker. I'm a forester with the Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed here in Fort Collins. We've been talking a lot about effects and effectiveness. I'm going to flip to the other side of the phrase and talk a little bit more about the treatments. What have we been doing? What can we do? And I've called it considerations for action in Northern Colorado, really focus on an area of Northern Colorado where we're doing stuff. We've been doing stuff for several years. And do we really know the effects of what we're doing? Is the important part, I think, to get out of all this. So CPRW, Coalition for the Poudre River Watershed, we are a nonprofit here in Fort Collins with a mission to improve and maintain the ecological health of the Poudre River Watershed through community collaboration. Simple enough, right? We work on the stream side of things as well as the forest side of things, do a lot of stream restoration work post-fire, and also a lot of forest management, forest manipulation before the fire. Also kind of a false dichotomy. We know it's all before a fire and it's all after a fire, right? It's just kind of thinking about those time scales for what actions you want to take. We work on the pre-fire side of things, or recent pre-fire side of things, as part of the Northern Colorado Fireshed Collaborative, which is an umbrella organization of pretty much all the organizations and entities in Northern Colorado that are interested in forest management, watershed health and resilience, all those types of things on kind of the wildfire mitigation, forest restoration side of things. The idea of the Fireshed Collaborative on this huge area of Northern Colorado, I think I've got a pointer here. Several counties, several watersheds, but we're really going for resilient landscapes that can receive fire in a way that allows fire to have some beneficial effects, as opposed to a lot of the negative effects we've seen from some of the larger fires in the last couple of decades. In order to do so, we move a lot of wood around. We change the way the wood is in the forest. We try to get some wood out of there. We try to burn some wood. A lot of wood movement and wood management to get these things done, and also trying to get more fire back on the ground, both on federal ground, and that is, as Greg pointed out earlier, a lot of community engagement, education and outreach, that kind of thing, to make us all feel safer with wildland fire, and also prescribed fire, both on federal ground, private ground, state ground, all those kinds of things to head towards resilience. Now, we have a lot of organizations, like I said, 30 plus in the Fireshed Collaborative. And so when we talk about treatment effectiveness, we're all coming at this with different ideas in mind. We're narrowing down towards something. I think we can do a lot of these things with a lot of the treatments that we do, but a lot of us are thinking different things when we're talking about treatment effectiveness. Are we talking about wildfire mitigation, slowing the spread? We're talking about fire intensity, things like flame length, crowning index, those kinds of things are very important to think about. If the treatments we're doing aren't modifying fire behavior at all, they're probably not that effective. We all talk a lot about forest health, whatever that means. There's a whole lot to think about when you're thinking about what forest health is on a larger scale, forest resilience on a larger scale. A lot of us, we're thinking about water quality, water supply. and watershed resilience. And one of the metrics we've looked at to think through that is, say you treat a couple hundred acres to a certain extent on the ground and fire were to come through there, how much sediment did you avoid getting into the stream system? Talk about a complex calculation. Be great to know, but I'm not sure how to get there as far as with the scale of treatments that we're doing. A lot of us are thinking, especially folks like emergency management, sheriff's office, fire protection districts, community groups, and others are thinking about life and property. Talk about the cabin next to the tree, exactly. Community protection, evacuation routes, firefighting effectiveness. Where can we stage? Where can we make a stand against these fires as they move to and through communities? We're also thinking about things like habitat for pollinators, for game species. We're also thinking about diversity in structure, forest structure, openings, that kind of thing. Understory grasses, forbs, and shrubs, and then the fire adapted vegetation that we know really needs that fire to regenerate. So those are effects and effectiveness for sure. Northern Colorado, it's big for sure. It's an absolute checkerboard. I'm zoomed in a little bit from the Fireshed Collaborative landscape. This is the Poudre River watershed in white, and the blue is the Upper Poudre watershed project area, kind of the forested area that the Fireshed Collaborative is working in, just in the Poudre River landscape, Poudre River watershed landscape. As you can see, and I'll get a little more into this, I mean, you've got urban and ag land down here outside of the upper watershed. You've got this kind of montane zone where you really do have a checkerboard of ownership. The green is Forest Service, the white is private, the blue and yellow is state, and especially up here, you get a lot of state land board and an absolute checkerboard of management complexity. And then the further up in the watershed you go, up into subalpine vegetation, you really get into more federal ground. So how do you manage that middle zone that we've been talking about, kind of that fire management zone, resilient zone, when it's such a checkerboard? You can't just treat the green squares in here because you've only done half or maybe even less than half of the job in there. So what do we do? Where do we do it? As far as where do we do it, we have a lot of different, we are lucky in Northern Colorado to have a lot of great research universities and Forest Service installations and restoration institutes and others that give us a lot of great information on where should we work. CPRW uses what you're seeing here. We have our Upper Poudre Watershed Resilience Plan that we contracted in 2017 and updated in 2024. And this is really looking at that upper watershed at the 7th level watershed level, HUC 14 level. A couple thousand acres, 5,000 at the most or so acres at a time. If you're looking at resilient uplands, resilient stream systems, and resilient water supply, where are the most critical areas to work? So we have a pretty good idea of where some of those might be, especially in this kind of middle zone where we can do a lot of management. That lines up pretty well. You've heard a lot about potential operational delineations already today, pods. That lines up pretty well with this, what we call the ribbon of priority pods on the landscape, and these were determined through a collaborative process. Matt already mentioned Daniel Godwin and a lot of the workshops we've done through the Fireshed Collaborative to look at the pods on the landscape and decide which ones are the priority ones for actual fuels treatment and management on the ground. A lot of those priorities line up pretty well, as you can see right there. We also have CFRI's quantitative wildfire risk assessment that allows us to drill down a little closer on the landscape for where we might actually want to do work. We have the Colorado State Forest Service wildfire risk assessment as well. We have community wildfire protection planning priorities, both for fuels treatment, evacuation routes, all those kinds of things. We have a pretty good idea of where to work, but what do you do when you get there? Well, we have a pretty good idea too of what our options are. We know that in Northern Colorado, based on contractor availability and access and things like that, we can do several things depending on the type of ground. This also all depends on workforce availability and contracting and grant money and all that kind of thing. That's another webinar all to itself. But on steep ground here in northern Colorado, what can we do? If it's steep ground, if it's tough access, if you got to hike in with chainsaws, you're really going to only be treating the smaller diameter fuels. You're going to be treating ladder fuels, limbing things up, really only go into about 6-inch diameter material that you're actually cutting. And then you're piling that stuff and then trying to get the piles burned, which is its own challenge. That's another webinar by itself too. Again, you are limited to the smaller diameter fuels here. You can do some good based on the modeling that we've done through Forest Vegetation Simulator and others. Every time we're doing this stuff, we're putting in pre and post treatment plots and running the models and figuring out, did we do what we said we were going to do? But this type of thin from below activity, you can make some differences in fire behavior. You can reduce the flame length significantly. You can increase the crowning index significantly, something like 15-mile-an-hour wind to get a fire in the crown before treatment to 40 or 45-mile-an-hour wind to get a crown fire after treatment. That's significant. Is it significant enough? Don't know. But that's pretty much what we're limited to on a lot of those slopes. But we also know that those steep slopes, those dense steep slopes are important to treat. We know that that's where a lot of the fires we've seen, High Park, Cameron Peak, got a lot of their energy. They made runs up a lot of those steep slopes in that dense timber, gave them a lot of energy to make those big runs that we saw, especially during the Cameron Peak fire. So we need to do this stuff. How effective is what we're doing? That's what we're trying to get to. Also, with that, you're not getting to the ground layer. You're not getting the litter, the duff, the rotten wood, all that stuff on the ground. It's just, you're not going to be out there picking up the sticks that are already on the ground. It's just too expensive to do. If you've got gentler slopes and better access, you can get some big machines in there, which is really great. That way you can do removals across all size classes, not just the small stuff. You can really knock some holes in the canopy, really disconnect those canopy groupings, reintroducing openings. All this stuff is great for biodiversity, the shrub layer, the pollinators, all that kind of thing, all the habitat. But with those treatments, again, you're really limited to not getting to those steep slopes and the tougher access. You got to have a road where you can get these machines in, that kind of thing. And you're still not getting at the litter, the duff, the rotten wood, those ground fuels that were already out there before you did the treatment. And in some areas of these treatments, you're adding a decent amount of ground fuel after the treatment as well. And so, you know, what's the balance there? How much are these worth? Both of those types of treatments are expensive. We're up in the $3,000 to $4,000 to $5,000 range for most of these treatment types. And what we really need to know, I think, is what's effective. We all know we have to define that a little better. What's effective and where? How much does it cost? And is it worth the cost? There are some other options, these things here in the middle that we've tried several of these as well. You can do some mastication. You can chew all that stuff up and leave it on the ground. Not terribly ideal. You end up with a pretty good fuel bed. That is good in some spots, but you don't want a contiguous fuel bed of more than 3 or 4 inches on the ground. So you're going to choke out the vegetation that way, and you leave a lot of material that can get fire in it and smolder for weeks. So maybe it's effective at the initial fire spread, but if it smolders forever, how effective is that as a firefighting measure? So about the same thing with chipping, you know, okay, in some locations, best to get that material off the ground. You got to leave some patches not too deep. There's the whole tree chipping and moving the material off site, which is great. That gets the fuel out of there. What happens to those chips once they're trucked away? That's kind of a mystery. Some of them get used for animal bedding, for oil and gas pad reclamation, that kind of thing, but there's not a huge need for billions of pounds of wood chips in this area. So we just don't have a lot of infrastructure and ability to do a lot of wood utilization in this area. And so we just have a lot of wood we got to do something with. And then we've also got this new toy in northern Colorado, this air curtain burner. We got several of them actually on the landscape in northern Colorado now. I just went to a demo of that the other day up in Glacier View Meadows, and it was really neat. Got rid of about 80 cubic yards of material in a couple hours once that thing was fired up and running, which is awesome. That's got a lot of potential for like community scale use with some evacuation route or home ignition zone work, that kind of thing. Is it a potential treatment for a grand scale? Yeah, maybe if you had a whole lot of them and you can deploy them in the right spots, for sure. But these are kind of the options that we have for moving wood around and managing the actual wood. How effective they are, I think there's a lot that we can learn how effective they are. They're also expensive, like I said, and also mentioned action, because we're already doing this stuff. We're already doing all of this stuff. I think we need more information on what's the best treatment and where, what should it cost, what's too expensive, what doesn't work. All those kinds of things are really good data points for us to investigate as we go. And the other side of this is we're spending public money doing this. This is all grant money. We have, through the Fireshed Collaborative now, we have an investment committee working with the National Forest Foundation to take federal money and give it out to Fireshed partners to do these types of treatments. Since that is your tax money at work, we should probably not waste it on treatments that don't work. So it'd be really good to have more information on what works and where, how much should it cost. The ultimate goal really is fire on the landscape, whether that be wildfire in areas where that is okay and not too scary and all that kind of thing. But then also prescribed fire on the landscape, both on federal and private and state and other grants. We've worked really hard to get fire on the landscape in a lot of these areas, but it is incredibly hard to do. On the federal ground, it's mainly a matter of horsepower, more money, more people, more stuff. Get it out there, get it burned. On the private side of the fence, it is much harder. There is no clear way of getting a lot of prescribed fire on the ground on the private side of the checkerboard in northern Colorado. The great thing about prescribed fire there, you really are getting at those ground fuels, the litter layer, duff layer. You're regenerating a lot of that fire adapted vegetation. You're knocking holes in the canopy. You're doing all the stuff with fire, but fire as a management tool has all kinds of challenges, as you might imagine. Zooming in on the landscape a little bit more, I'll wrap this up here pretty quick. I want to show you a lot of what we've been working on just in one particular area of northern Colorado, actually one particular area of the Poudre River watershed. So zoom this out hundreds of times, and this is the challenge on a grander scale. What you're seeing here, the red, of course, is the Cameron Peak fire. The big yellow blobs are big areas of either planned or completed federal prescribed fire. And you can see this one here had a big effect on the Cameron Peak fire. We're talking effectiveness. This big area of federal prescribed fire had a distinct effect on Cameron Peak as it moved up the watershed or down the watershed, up towards Elkhorn Creek this way. Kind of hit that, lost a lot of energy, squirted north where there wasn't treated ground, and continued that run. The fire actually interacted with some larger scale mechanical treatments there. So think feller bunchers and skidders again, dramatic basal area reduction, canopy gaps, all that kind of thing. Interacted with some of those treatments in green right here and made a difference in firefighting effectiveness during the Cameron Peak fire. Firefighters were able to get back in there with the fire coming, make more of a stand, save some structures and slow down fire behavior there. This is the Magic Feather prescribed fire, which is in process right now. You'll probably see some notifications about that.
I don't think they can see the pointer.
Oh, can they not see the pointer?
Well, if you put it on the screen.
Yeah.
You might.
Gotcha, that's gonna be, yeah. Anyway, big yellow blob in the middle. Yeah, thanks, Tim. Is the Magic Feather prescribed fire. And this is about a 6,000 acre prescribed fire cross boundary that the Forest Service has been working on for several years. The purple blobs that you see there, those are private lands prescribed fire, broadcast prescribed fire. Some of those were done with thinning beforehand. Some of those were done with no thinning beforehand. And again, huge challenge to get that going on the ground. The big one there took 13 different agencies, all kinds of funding, all kinds of coordination and that kind of thing. Way different than the calculus for expanding broadcast prescribed fire on federal ground. And then the green in there are all the treatments that we've done over the past 8 or 9 years. And so something to think about here, pushing back just a little bit on the random acts of restoration thing. The first one looks random, but if you keep going for 8 or 9 years and you string them along the same creek, it becomes less random. You start to build up. some treatments in the same area a little more strategically. So that's what we've really tried to do there. That's along the Elkhorn Creek corridor. Some of those were the thin from below piling, get rid of the piles, burn the piles if you can, when you can. Some of those were mechanical restoration treatments with large machinery, that kind of thing. And then again, the purple there for scrap fire on the ground, broadcast for scrap fire. The black lines that you see, those are all private property lines. So the idea here was if a fire like Cameron Peak were to come out of the wilderness, down the hill, get into that canyon and start coming up Elkhorn Creek, down towards the community at Glacier View Meadows, we're trying to build kind of that ribbon or that catcher's mitt there to slow things down and enable firefighters to get in there, maybe, hopefully keep some structures that wouldn't burn when the fire got through there, that kind of thing. But this has taken several years to put these treatments on the ground. Again, I don't think we have all the information we need about how effective are those treatments. Should we even be doing the steep slope, tough access, piling and burning stuff? Do we know how effective that is? Is it worth it? These are a lot of the questions that we have. And this is a funding question as well. Just the treatments that you see here in green, that's about $2.5 million worth of funding spent over the course of 9 years for this. And so are we really getting to pace and scale here? You know, if this is what we've been able to do over a decade, are we really getting to that landscape scale that we need to get to meet this challenge? That's kind of an open question. And whether these treatments are effective and how effective is a big part of that answer. We hear a lot lately that fire is the treatment. And so if the ultimate goal is broadcast prescribed fire on the ground, what do these other treatments do? Are they first entries? Is a big mechanical treatment a first entry? And then you really haven't completed it until you burn it? That's an open question as well. On Forest Service land, it is easier to do those larger blocks of prescribed fire. But then also on Forest Service land, there's something to think about there as far as not freaking everybody out with a whole bunch of fire. Sometimes we're burning, when are we burning? Sometimes we're burning when we're not going to get the fire effects that we need to actually do the treatment that we need because we don't want to really put a whole lot of smoke in the air. So that's something to think about there. On the private side, on the private land side of things, getting that broadcast prescribed fire on the ground is incredibly complicated. The three you see here are all on one landowner. That's a Boy Scout ranch, and they were willing to try all these things out on their property. There are not a whole lot of landowners lined up want you to light their property on fire at the moment. We're getting there though. I think we actually have a few treatments that we've done, either mechanical or thin from below, where we've gotten rid of some of the ground fuels and that kind of thing. And some of those folks are interested in seeing what a broadcast fire might do. Probably several years away, but we're getting there. So social license is a huge part of that. The insurance and the liability landscape in Colorado is not really conducive to a lot of fire on the ground of any type, either pile burning or broadcast prescribed fire. So if we can't or won't or don't burn it, what are we doing? What should we do? So are those steep slope treatments worth it? Are the mechanical treatments worth it? There's a lot of question about, are we getting to the ground layer, the duct layer, all that kind of thing that we really need to do. And again, we're spending public money to do this. So answers to these questions would be super useful to know what's effective where, how big does it need to be, where does it need to be oriented, how much should we spend to do it? They're all kind of open questions, but we're getting there. Very quickly, I'm going to run through this. If we zoom in even a little further, and we look just at one of these 7th level watersheds that we know is highest priority. It's got a lot of potential to burn hot. When it does burn hot, we know we're going to get erosion and sediment into a nearby creek. And if we zoom in kind of on that pink area there where some work has already been done, I want to add just a little bit more to the treatment effectiveness thing. As you can see in there, there's some white blobs. Those are areas we've already treated, and we still need to burn the slash piles in there. The red areas are other forested slopes that I think we could treat either mechanically or in that thin from below pile burning kind of fashion. The dots that you see are culverts that we went out and measured that we know are undersized and we know will not handle post-fire flows that we've modeled in these areas based on high burn severity. And then there's some hatched areas along the creek there. That's another study we've done where we've looked at depositional zones and areas where the water can reconnect to the floodplain, spread out, slow down, drop out some sediment and ash and that kind of thing. So if we're really thinking about building resilience on this 7th level watershed scale, the scale of a couple thousand acres, what do we need to do? We probably need to treat the forest where we can, the best we can, for whatever price is reasonable. We also need to do the stream restoration work to give that sediment and ash a place to go when it does burn, however it burns. And then we need to think about the infrastructure, the culverts, the road crossings, that kind of thing, because we know on the post-fire side of things, when those blow out because they're too small and you have a big post-fire flow, then you end up with a whole lot of sediment and ash and stuff like that in the stream system. So thinking about effectiveness, I think there's also the stream side of things, and are we really building that into the equation? So a lot of questions. I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thanks so much to the panel. I'm just gonna hop in here real quick and let everybody know that Tony will tag team facilitating questions with our panel and each other. Between the in-person folks, we're scheduled to continue till about 12:30. We're saving all the resources and comments posted in chat, and those will go out to all the attendees as well as the video recording. So I have a couple questions in chat already. If the in-person people are putting together their questions. I have one possibly for Daniel. I'm hoping you all can still hear me. Greg, you're our test. Can you hear me asking the question?
Yes, I can. You're coming in
All right.
loud and clear.
Thank you. So we have a mapping question here. Thanks, everybody, for holding on. John Walker has a question. Will effectiveness mapping be able to incorporate hour by hour fire conditions and progression as it impacts fire lines and treatments? And will satellite telemetry play a role? That's a great Matt question.
I think in the ideal, yes, but I think that's still several years out. Is that pithy enough?
I feel like we, as silly as it may sound, we've gotten a lot better at going from just the perimeters that incident command teams create, at kind of random intervals when they need to at least like consistent daily progression maps to kind of understand potential interactions with treatments on a daily scale, but hourly, not quite yet.
I think maybe, there's resources like FireGuard that could eventually be used for those purposes. But yeah, I mean, some of the work that Camille has been involved in looking at, daily spread events, you could compare that against treatment interactions as well as suppression actions and begin to at least expand the envelope of what we know. But I think hour by hour might be a little aspirational at this point.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And while Camille is tagging on to Matt's answer, John also asked, has anyone experimented with bacterial and fungi inoculation to hasten the decomposition of surface fuel accumulations, which has a lot of significant research here on the Front Range. But Camille, do you want to speak to some of your research on it?
Suited for that.
I'm aware of some, yeah. I haven't seen a whole lot of results yet. It's a scale issue, probably. I have slash piles on the landscape that have been there for 3 or 4 years that I wish I would have inoculated. Why not, right? I think it's got a lot of potential for the chip and mastication mats of material that's left on the ground if you inoculate it. As you do it, again, probably a scale issue there. I don't know about the actual piles of slash, whether that would be effective or not, whether that's the time frame that would be effective or not. But I'm aware of, there's a lot of interest and a lot of good research going on. Anything to add to that?
No, yeah, I think that's the difficult part, right? Is how much spores, or inoculum do you need to put out on the landscape to effectively increase our relatively unproductive, if not very unproductive ecosystems that we have here in Colorado, especially.
I know that there's an affiliate with coalitions and collaboratives, and I can't remember their name right now. I'm hunting for it. That-
Yes.
Jeff Savage, that's right. That's working on specific strains of fungi that will digest Rocky Mountain cellulose and wood products. And they're growing and they've been building success. So I'll hunt for that and put the link in the chat.
And last thought on that, Gloria, would be, scale again.
Yeah.
I think me, one Forster, writing his own grants, running his own projects, if I can make 1,000/5 a year. That's a lot of wood to be decomposing, that's for sure.
Okay, we can turn it over to in-person questions here real quick.
Yep, there any questions in the room? Or, I know there's a lot of folks who've been involved in this work in the room and online too, so if there's big themes you'd like to share, feel free to speak up as well. Yep.
I have some sort of thoughts and questions. Thanks everybody, really informative. So something I didn't hear you all talk about, but I'm sure it's on your mind, is that the home ignition zone and what's happening in communities as it relates to, fuels, treatment effectiveness, and like community risk reduction. So I guess I'd just like your thoughts, where you're at with kind of putting this all together. And it just seems like there's just a really important aspect of what's happening on the other side of the fence in, HOAs or on the individuals.
I could start that out, I'm sure everybody could add something to that, but we've been involved through the NOCO Watershed Collaborative with a lot of community protection plans in the upper watershed.
Daniel, let me pause just real quick.
Yeah.
Greg, online, are you able to hear the questions in the room or should we repeat them?
Yeah, actually, I heard that quite well.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, I know, it's like a wizard. Yeah, so we've been involved in a lot of these CW, Community Welfare Protection Planning, CWPP processes. And I think a lot of that is managing expectations. There's kind of a national debate going on about where do you do what? We just make sure our piles of firewood are moved away from our homes and we've got metal roofs and then cross our fingers, or do we do the landscape scale stuff further up in the woods? Do we just manage wildfire? I think the answer is all of those. A lot of the community scale stuff, what you're able to do there as far as evacuation route and home ignition zone type of work, it's not going to stop any big fires coming through. We know that, but what it could do is give you more time to get out of the way more safely. It could also mean that you have something to come back to. Maybe your cabin is still there. Maybe there's some live trees still in the area because some of that work has been done in and among. So I think those are all very important. Part of that also, and Greg mentioned this earlier and that addressed it really well, is if you feel safer, you are more likely to be okay with other things going on. And so if you know that you've done everything you can on the evacuation route, and you know that you can all get out of there in time, and you have a pretty good idea that your cabin will be there and that some trees will still be alive when you get back, then you're probably not calling for immediate suppression as quickly as you would on some of those fires that are several miles away. And so I think that gets at another factor in effectiveness here. Is a home ignition zone treatment effective at any greater scale than just your front yard? Yeah, I think it is if you feel safer. And then as a society, we're kind of stomp out every fire back then. That happens up in the woods. So some initial thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a microcosm of the kind of themes of the paper itself, which is that context and objectives really drive the kind of lenses you bring to look at effectiveness. So if you're talking about broad scale forest health, habitat, water supply protection, and facilitating suppression to prevent fires from burning into communities, then a lot of the things I think we talked about today probably speak more on balance to those. You're looking at the community, Dave Calkin and Camille Jimmy Barrett and others had that paper that came out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences recently, and that says like if your focus is on community protection, you start there and then you look outwards. So they are two very kind of different lenses.
I have a follow-up question for Daniel real quick, since you've done so much of so many different types of fuels treatments with all these different tools. Do you have any feedback on the range of material to leave for forest health? Because some perceptions are to remove as much as possible, which in some environments can be damaging and drying. And some people have a tendency to leave too much, otherwise it looks like it's been bombed or something. So do you have any feedback on that happy medium of what to leave for forest health that's not as much of a risk?
I think we do. I think we have some metrics there that are useful as far as snag densities, for example, that we all try to leave for habitat, coarse woody debris on the ground, for habitat and for nutrient cycling and that kind of thing. I think there's a lot of range there, and I mean, I know a little bit about everything, not a whole lot about anything. And so I think we're really still kind of dialing in on a lot of those. I don't think there's a danger that we're going to treat the landscape to the extent. We're not going to treat every acre. And so a lot of this is where we're having local effects. If we're looking at the whole landscape, I don't think we have a lot to worry about as far as we're going to treat every acre to some too great extent. That's not good.
Thanks.
Any other questions in the room here? Comments?
I think a lot about like landscape scale. And something that I hadn't thought about before was the human dimensions of that, which I think is a really interesting concept. Could maybe any of you expand on that a little bit more and thinking about like maybe thoughts on that landscape scale effects of treatments generally?
Well, maybe I'll take a first stab at it. I think that we do a funny thing when we talk about treatments, right? When we implement them, when we put them on the ground, what we're really doing is changing something at that very local scale, right? And yet when a fire comes, we expect it to change something outside of it, right? Which is like a very human perception of like, oh, well, if we do something here, it should change something around it, when in fact, those conditions haven't changed at all. And we, I think for a long time, did a really bad job of both communicating that to the public, that like, just because we treated all this wonderful area near your house does not mean that when a fire goes all the way through that treatment to your house, that's going to do anything, right? But I think we also did a bad job of really internally, or as scientists and managers, understanding what potential effect we could have outside, right? Even in landscape scale analyses, we often think about what's happening within one polygon versus some control or reference outside of that polygon, instead of how one may be influencing the other as like a fire moves in that direction, right? And that's maybe getting better at quantifying that, but a difficult thing to do, like where is the edge of where we could even expect the treatment to actually have any influence on is really hard to understand, right? If you do 100-acre treatment, is it going to impact 1,000 acres or just the next 100 over, for example? I don't have anything on human dimension side.
Well, I mean, the human dimension side, that I think just picking up on what Camille just mentioned is risk communication. And how effectively have we conveyed like the true scope of what's attainable in terms of our risk management interventions. We do a lot of simulation modeling that suggests we can do all these wonderful things if only we treated 30% of the landscape, but it's very rare that we're actually getting to that scale. And then in terms of like the models of actual fire behavior and looking at, do we see landscape scale effects from treatment units? There was a Joint Fire Science funded paper fairly recently, and I think Terry Jane was on and Nate Anderson, that said that sort of science is still fairly in its infancy. So I think there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of work to do there, and it gets back to I think that original question too of finer scale data products too, because when you start to look at that and like we don't have really fine resolution data for like direction of fire spread, rate of spread, and all those things that I think are really important for these questions. But you know, as we make advances in all these technologies, we'll probably have more information to work with there. Another thing that came to mind with that comment is screen. You know, Daniel made the point about, and looking at Daniel's maps, right? So let me explain this figure first. This is within the Cameron Peak Fire, Northern Colorado. Number of hectares treated or that burned in previous wildfire by treatment type. And you know, it's again from this figure here, previous wildfire and prescribed fire are the things that we're seeing at scale across the burn area. Look at Daniel's maps, right? Those yellow blobs really jumped out. And that's where, so that's I think where we have the, you know, those prescribed fires are where you can achieve a lot of that scale, but that's the most connected to social license and all of these other complicating factors. So I think that's another.
We have, oh, go ahead. We have a
Question about cost. So Daniel, you said a few times, how much should treatments cost? And so I'm interested from an implementer's perspective. Do like avoided costs have to exceed expected treatment costs in order to be approved? Do you consider, or would you consider co-benefits in that calculus? Yeah, just expand on that thought a little bit.
Those are the questions, Ellie, for sure. And I think especially now that through the fire shed, we are moving public money towards potential treatment types. It's really, you know, kind of coming to bear, at least within the fire shed. What do you spend money on? Are some of those treatments just not worth doing because they don't have the predicted fire effects, so they're not avoiding the erosional component or that kind of thing? And you know, I think that a lot of that is really still an open question. And as far as, you know, I've sat on a couple grant review committees, and we all kind of have a general idea of what things should cost. Just a couple of years ago, we all had $2,000 an acre in our head. If it was more than that, probably not worth it. We know that's wildly low now. Even the good access mechanical treatments are $3,000 and $4,000 an acre. So, you know, part of this is adjusting the expectations, not only of the implementers, but the people that are funding it. What do they expect to get out of a certain amount of money? What's 100K going to get you? Is $5,000 an acre too much? We heard somebody really interesting from Arizona a couple conferences ago. They all kind of blend together. They're talking about a heli logging job over their only water supply in Arizona at $10,000 to $12,000 an acre. Is that worth it if it's your only water supply? Probably so. Is that worth it on a hill slope in northern Colorado that's not terribly connected to a water supply, that kind of thing? Probably not. So I don't think we have a real full picture of what the avoided costs are yet. I don't think we have a lot of I don't think we have a lot of numbers on the co-benefits. You know, if I make a small opening in the woods and it benefits some bees, what is that worth? I don't know. So yeah, great question, but that's, I think, more clarity along those lines, and it may take a long time to get there, but that's really what we're shooting for. What do those costs per acre really mean? And then again, there's the human side that we've heard about a little bit today. You know, if you do something, this is controversial, but if you do something that doesn't do a lot for flame length or fire behavior, but gets everybody really excited, and then they get moving, and then they start doing stuff in their own communities, and then they're not calling for every lightning ignition to be stomped out immediately. Some benefit there. I don't know how you put a dollar figure on it. Great question.
We have an online person who'd like to unmute and ask questions. She's been waiting for a while. Kendra, do you want to go ahead?
I'd love to. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah. And can you introduce yourself? Kendra Fallon, a region fire ecologist.
Hi, I'm the region fire ecologist in R5, which is the Pacific Southwest region, also known as California for the most part. So I spend a lot of time, a lot of bandwidth on fuels treatment effectiveness. And I agree that one of the first things that I always think about is what is effective? And you provided a lot of fodder for me thinking about framing that up. But my question to you guys is, what is a fuels treatment then? How much modification of a vegetated area before it falls into being something worthy of being considered a fuels treatment and therefore have an expected modification of fire behavior. And, I think about that every time I go out to my favorite Christmas tree stand and I cut my tree. I'm like, at what point have I potentially created a fuels treatment? So I mean, I know my answer for the research that I do, but I wanted to flip it back to you to hear your guys' thoughts about that. Thank you.
Kendra, I was fortunate enough to see a presentation by Mark Finney. He was here in Colorado not too long ago presenting to the Arapahoe Rose Bowl. And I'm probably going to poorly paraphrase, so the errors are all mine. But he said if it's not followed by some application of surface fire, it's not a fuel stream.
Okay, I like that. I mean, I support that plan, absolutely.
I think we've all, some of our conversations have gone a different direction too, of like, well, I get why I talked earlier, right, where words are important, so I agree that you need to find fuels treatment, but also all these forest treatments are going to interact with fire, so we step back and said, we're not even gonna talk just about fuels treatments, talk about all forest management, because it will be interact with fire. But now if we're watching Daniel, I'm thinking, when you're thinking, and I think this is where when you think about the effects that you're after, your thinking changes a little bit, because if you are after watershed health, maybe you're not even talking about a forest treatment, you're talking about some restoration projects in the carrying areas. And so just some thoughts there.
Yeah, we really struggled, I think, even as a co-author group on this paper about what the term meant, right? Some people said that, well, I only look at restoration treatments. I don't know what you mean by fuels treatments, but I only look, we only research restoration. Which is, that's felt a little bit to me like splitting hairs, because most restoration treatments in at least lower elevation forests tend to match what a lot of the objectives of fuels treatments. But I do think that in this discussion about how fires are interacting with these treatments, we expect, if you talked, I feel like, to anybody in the general public or a community that's being impacted by a fire, no matter why that treatment was originally implemented, there is an expectation that it is modifying fires in some way, right? And so I think in that regard, it's almost like we need to be including everything in the database of things, the way we're modifying the landscape, and quantify whether or not they're worth it or not, because otherwise I think people are going to look at some place and say, well, it didn't work here. But you say that doing treatments are effective.
Kendra, do you want to pop in and let us know what your definition is?
Oh, okay. So for my research, I use key point 3 and 6, which are hazardous fuels treatments. But I mean, again, that's just the way that I went about it, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily the way. It's just, sideboards of effectiveness I found was really important, but so were, for me, establishing sideboards of what a fuels treatment was, because both of those terms start to kind of, they can have mission creep in terms of defining effectiveness. So it's just nice to talk to other people in the research area to hear their thoughts, and I appreciate the time.
Thank you. We've got 1 more minute to change the world in fuels treatment effectiveness. Do we have a graduate student here, right? That's co-author on the paper. Is that you? No?
Yep, that's me.
Yeah, Chris Choi is a co-author on the paper. Do you have any final thoughts?
Yeah, just thinking a lot about Kendra's question about how we consider what a treatment is. And so I did some of the, so I'm in Tony Vorster and Paul Evangelista's lab in the NREL. I did some work on analyzing the fuels treatments that occurred at Camille Peak. And one of the really difficult parts was you have all these different treatments from all these different agencies. but they all list them as the same names or similar names. How do you actually draw comparisons between them? And I was reflecting a lot on what you mentioned earlier about scale as well. And these agencies are working at different scales. Even if they're doing a thinning treatment, they're thinking about implementing it at different scales, but these treatments are always interacting with each other. And as a result, you're creating new treatments. And that's how some of these treatments up on this graph get created, thinning plus surface fuels plus pile burning. And so as you think about effectiveness and you think about what treatment is, teasing apart all these intricacies become very complicated. I think next paper on what is a treatment might be. Yeah, that'd be cool.
Great. Thanks, Chris. And shout out to Chris, who I met at a holiday party through Warner College, who told me about this research initially a couple years ago. So it's wonderful to have fruition of this from that conversation. Thank you, Chris.
That'd be cool.
Yeah.
That happened after your talk.
Great. Well, thanks everybody for joining today, and Chris, thanks for those closing thoughts there.
Any final comments from our wonderful minds?
Nuggets.
Nuggets.
So we can figure this out. It may take a while, but we'll get it figured out.
I'm gonna stretch just a couple minutes because I'm in charge of the off button. You did have an air curtain burner on there and you said it was a new toy, and we've been following the air curtain burner back and forth a little bit here in Colorado and surrounding states. So what's the current, and now you're using one, is that just on federal land?
No,
that's
this is
gone
just
past
on
the
private.
state?
Just on private. Yes.
So on private land, can use air curtain burner.
And there's still, I think there, and I haven't been the main point person on this one. I could talk about it, but that one, the small one that I showed was a grant that the Big Thompson Watershed Coalition put in through a state grant and ended up getting it purchased. And our job was to find different locations where we could use it. So we're doing some pilot treatments on private ground. One just happened up in Estes Valley, had one in Glacier View Meadows. There are others on the landscape. Division of Park Prevention and Control just got a big one of the non-mobile, or one that it is mobile, but it goes on a big truck. So it's going to take a big site, and so wood will mainly come to it. And I'll be excited to see that get deployed.
That's
in the
fabulous.
landscape.
Wonderful
So,
progress.
yeah, and it extends your burn windows. You don't need snow on the ground to do the burning. The permitting is a little different, that kind of thing. So with a lot of help from Loveland Fire and Laramie County Sheriff's Office Emergency Services, we're seeing this going to be out on the ground.
Great. Thank you all very much. It's been great. We hope to dovetail or springboard, another analogy, off of this into updates and more research on the ground work.